Nicole. Welcome to Life Matters. Well, today's show is going to look more on the international side, where we've visited with folks from Human Life International and the United Nations. And we have today a very special guest who's going to relay her experience. And she's a Ph.D. candidate at the Sorbonne in Paris, France. And she's in international relations, I believe. And she's had some really world experiences at such a tender young age. Well, welcome, Nicole Rudolph.
Thank you.
Nicole, how did you get involved in the worldwide scene? How did that all come about with yourself?
Well, I was interested in international relations from a young age. I was interested in language, and I studied French in high school. And then when I graduated college, I decided to do a Fulbright to South Korea. So
a Fulbright scholarship?
Yes.
Wow,
so I went
to
South Korea for that, and that was just a wonderful, eye-opening experience. And I was able to travel in Asia during that year abroad. And then following that, I went to Paris for a year, and I did a master's degree, and then Eastern France near Germany. And so I since returned and spent 3 years in Paris after that to continue studying. And so I've always just really loved traveling an international scene and meeting people.
And then how does that dovetail into your getting involved in the Right to Life movement, or seeing how some of these NGOs operate? And by the way, what is an NGO?
An NGO stands for non-governmental organization. And so they are organizations that can apply to special status. In particular, with regards to the United Nations, they can apply to go there and have representatives who are there that can lobby, essentially, for various organizations while there. And so while in South Korea and in France and in the United States, I taught for 8 years, actually, in the public and private and even private Catholic spectrum throughout these different continents. So I have a lot of experience with young people, especially in the high school level. And so kind of seeing the rapid change in how information was taught and just the results of living various lifestyles and what that was doing for the young population made it very interesting. And since I'm interested in the United Nations, I thought that it would be great to get some personal experience.
And then how did you find out about the battle that's been going on for a couple of decades now between, I'll call them the comprehensive sexuality education group versus, say, the Human Life International, or the organization that you've done work with? Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, I just volunteered for an organization that's called Family Watch International, and it's a non-religious based apolitical organization that uses a lot of its information based on social science research. And so bringing in really top experts from social science fields to present different aspects in sociology and social science, especially to these issues related to life and sexuality and the education thereof.
And what opened your eyes to all of this? What did you, when you finally figured out what was going on, when did that occur, that moment?
Well, I went on to the UN 3 or 4 times this year for the Commission on Population Development on the status of women, and those really opened my eyes when I saw the various groups that were lobbying there and the influence that they had, and also the money that was behind these organizations and how they were bringing in youth advocates from all over the world who had the same spin, if you would, and were all consistently giving the same information across the board. And so I wanted to challenge some of that information by asking specific questions related to health, especially the health of youth. So that was something that really concerned me. So I was made more aware of the Kinsey reports and other advocacy and kind of the inception of this movement towards comprehensive sexuality education with SECUS, which is an American-based organization.
It's an acronym for what? The Sexuality Information and Education something of the United States.
Yes, exactly.
And
Planned Parenthood, and particularly International Planned Parenthood, is very present there. In this last commission in April for the Commission on Population Development, I attended a lot of side panel events, the majority of which were sponsored to some extent by International Planned Parenthood Foundation.
So they're looking to do what? Population control, really? Is that what they're looking for? Is that what they're trying to advocate? Or what would you say that they're trying to advocate, basically?
What they are using in a sophistry kind of technique, what they're advocating for is what they call sexual and reproductive health issues and human rights, really. So sexual and reproductive health rights for adolescents and young people. What that involves is a very broad program that has been highly developed across different borders. For example, International Planned Parenthood has worked with the Girl Scouts International to develop a pamphlet that I've seen in English and in French for adolescents and youth that are HIV positive. And what was concerning and or disturbing to me when I was reading this was that it would go against some international guidelines. For example, they would say—
Of what? Of good, normal, healthy practices?
Of even international law. So for example, they would say you do not need to disclose your HIV positive status to a future partner. And it was a little bit disturbing because many countries have laws for the protection of other individuals, just to have a full disclosure so that people could know, if someone knows up front, so that they could be told. So there's a lot of, I would almost say, indoctrination elements. I don't like to use that term, but specifically for youth and young adults. And what concerned me specifically was that it wasn't comprehensive. It said it was comprehensive, but it was leaving out a lot of information. And it was also, I would almost say, over-sexualizing children. And so in some UNESCO documents, you would have
UNESCO, what's that again?
The United Nations Education,
SCO, whatever.
Sorry, my mind's still blanking. It's very well known. I would participate in Paris also while I was there, but the children's, yeah.
So they're trying to sexualize kids at a very young age. How young do they go?
Well, the official programs start at age 5. However, there were talk about sensibilizing children at an earlier age with certain issues. So at age 5, and including, there were talk that because of outcry that they changed the wording. So they were introducing masturbation at from the age of 5 to 8 in some of the documents, and normalizing a lot of behaviors that could be dangerous to young children and to adolescents. And so when they're normalized and the risk factor is taken out, and so that's what concerns me, because the real risk factor is not being presented. So they're sharing information and not sharing the risk involved with choices that are made by...
I mean, that they could contract sexually transmitted diseases, or that are they psychologically and emotionally ready for all of this?
Yes. Now, they've tried to develop a very comprehensive program where UNESCO and the United Nations Population Fund, they've developed a program that's called It's All One, and it's very well developed, and this is their goal during this last conference, was to get it passed internationally in all countries so that sexual and reproductive health rights were rights for adolescents. However, there were problems because even the age of adolescence would change. So some would say from 10 on that the education of sexuality would be taught more on a different level that would come from government and that would come from organizations such as International Planned Parenthood.
And so are they trying to drive a wedge between parents and children?
They would not say that.
Is this a government organizations trying to drive?
Okay.
Or NGOs? Well, they wouldn't say it outright.
No, that would not be the terminology used. They would say that they're trying to provide children access to comprehensive sexual and reproductive health information. However, what they're promoting and asking for money for is to create more centers for sexual and reproductive health access, especially in rural areas. And their desire is to be able to have hours where school children would be able to access it that are convenient to when they're going to school, and to be able to eliminate parental rights and also eliminate marital rights so that husbands would not necessarily know whether or not their wives could be having abortions. And so the desire is to have a greater access to comprehensive sexuality information, to contraception, and to abortion. And so those are the desired outcomes that they're going for. My concern was more when you're looking at the social science research and you're actually looking at the outcomes, especially in Africa. Dr. Green at Harvard did a study on this a few years ago that was very, very interesting, where he actually showed that increasing the use of condoms was exacerbating the problem, especially in certain epidemics.
So it wasn't solving the problem, it was exacerbating the problem.
Yes. But there are many groups that would benefit from this. But my concern, as someone who's been educating young people, and I've in Asia, in the United States, and in Europe, I've seen a lot more risks of health risks for children. And I'm not only talking about sexually transmitted diseases, but there's a large ignorance of that, particularly HPV, which is the most widespread sexually transmitted disease in the U.S.
Human papillomavirus.
Exactly. And the problem with that is increasingly most men do not know that they carry it, and it can be passed easily through oral sex. And so I actually was at the dentist yesterday, and she said she sees increasingly more and more kids coming in with cancer of the mouth due to sexually transmitted diseases that they're unaware of, that they could contract. And with HPV, you can contract that even if you're wearing a condom, because it's skin-to-skin contact. And so there are health consequences to that, because the children are, and adolescents, or even young adults or adults, even postmenopausal, there's an interesting study about that recently, are contracting these diseases. And the trouble with young girls is that their cervix is more vulnerable at that time, and they're more likely to contract diseases.
So when you say young girls, what, in the teenage years?
Yes, in the teenage years specifically. But with HPV in particular, it's disturbing because you can get cervical cancer, and you can also, it's a cause of infertility. And so I think that there are just a lot of secondary and tertiary health, both physical and mental health consequences that a lot of people are totally ignorant of. And I mean, by ignorant, I mean in the French sense, meaning unaware of.
Right.
And so oftentimes what happens is you've taken the ideology of the 1960s of more feminist movement and said that women should not have to be enslaved to their bodies. And so they should be able to have freedom, as do men, to control their sexual health. And so there was a lot of increase in contraception, but then when the HIV/AIDS virus came out, and there's been a huge influx of sexually transmitted diseases, but beyond that, even that component, there is the component, I would say, of mental health, because there's been interesting studies done lately. Dr. Miriam Grossman, in particular, has outlined the teaching of sexuality education in the United States. It's very interesting. And Dr. Meg Meeker has done a lot of work on adolescence. And so as a physician practicing, she has seen a lot of adolescents coming in and suffering not only with STDs and sometimes with infertility, but with increased rates of depression. And this is all something that neuroscience has been showing us about the bonding elements of any kind of actual sexual arousal and sexual activity. And so there are all these elements that happen, the bonding that forms. There's a chemical called oxytocin that releases. There's the dopamine, the pleasure producing, and in men there's vasopressin also. And what happens with this is it creates a bond, like a real scientifically, it's science
man
too,
and woman.
between, or even between any kind of thing of pleasure, but in particular when you take adolescents that are engaging in sexual arousal and activity, they're forming this bond. And then what happens when that bond is broken is often it can result in depression. And so I've seen that increasingly throughout the different areas that I've been teaching in. There's not only a greater need for therapy, but almost, I would say, a disillusionment sometimes in love and in sexuality.
Now, a lot of people don't find out they're infertile until they get married and try to have children, and
Yes.
that may be in their early 30s for women, and
Yes.
and it's a great disappointment to them. And have they figured out that it tracks back to maybe when they were more promiscuous, when they were like teenagers or in their early 20s?
Not always, but that's another thing that contraception actually often masks is true sexual and reproductive health of women. There are many methods that have been developed for a while now, commonly called natural family planning methods, but there's some specific models also that really deal with whether it's symptothermal or mucus, different natural markers in the women. There's the Creighton model, Billings method. There are many natural methods that are very interesting and that are a lot more cost-effective to learn and to teach. And they're pretty accurate also, extremely accurate in the studies that have been done. And so, for example, I have one of my best friends, she teaches this. And so she was explaining to me different things, and I had started learning the method. And it's a wonderful thing to learn even when you're younger, because what can happen in the female cycle is if you're tracking your natural markers, for example, when your progesterone levels can be off, that is something that often causes miscarriages. And so if you are tracking just your natural fertility, you are able to then go to your doctor and say, listen, I've been looking at this. I might have, and then you can take specific blood tests and get that taken care of beforehand. So a lot of people are having miscarriages due to endometriosis that hasn't been caught because of being on the pill or other natural things. And this is all a very natural way that I think that might promote true sexual and reproductive health.
Now, on the international scene,
Yes.
is much of this ever talked about? I mean, we here in America perhaps have a higher level of knowledge of the Creighton model or natural family planning. I wouldn't think that International Planned Parenthood would ever promote anything like that. What organizations are fighting International Planned Parenthood? Or I think Marie Stopes is another organization over there. What's the battle going on between the pro-life groups that you were a volunteer for one of them internationally and the other side?
Well, with that, I think that there just has to be perhaps even a new level of dialogue between leaders on this. And so it's not so much a kind of battle or a confrontation, so much as letting the truth about what is good for the human person in their integral form be revealed through scientific evidence and through experiential evidence. And so there is not a lot being done on this internationally right now. There are organizations such as Family Watch International. There's certain organizations, some that lobby at the UN. Women who have had abortions are coming and speaking out about some of the health consequences, both psychological and physical, that they have suffered because of it. And little by little, you're starting to hear about this on the international scene. But as a general rule, there's been like one main discussion that has been promoted on government levels through organizations such as Planned Parenthood. And that is a message that is saying that you have a right to express yourself sexually in any way that you so desire. And to do so, these are certain factors that will help reduce risk. However, the truth of the message is that many of these behaviors that people are choosing, believing that they are safe, are very unsafe, both to physical and to mental health. And I'm seeing that a lot in my generation also. Many friends have confided in me that they have sexually transmitted diseases that will never go away. Some that they might be infertile, others that they've had suffered through different effects of abortion. And so I'm seeing that the truth that is being taught, that you can do anything without any consequences, or with very limited consequences, is not helpful. It's not helping women, it's not helping men, it's not helping our society, because the cost is billions and billions and billions of dollars when you look at the secondary and tertiary effects of this, when you're looking not only at the medicine that is needed to take care of sexually transmitted diseases, the medicine for contraceptive use, but also the medicine to the breakdown of the family and to the breakdown of different social structures, and even the extreme costs of depression, even if the cost of depression on work in the workforce, or the cost of depression on the stress that it creates within family structures or between work structures. And so I would just love for people to be more aware of the facts, of real documented evidence for these issues.
Mm-hmm. Well, I know that in the past couple of decades, maybe 3 or 4 decades, the strategy for getting into these other countries and into Africa is to do a top-down approach. Go to the health minister, and they might do whatever, pay him off or whatever, and then try to influence the upper people in government. And it's a kind of a top-down approach where they force it onto these societies. And is there any way to really combat that, that in an effective way?
Well, one other technique
internationally,
exactly. I would like to also speak to another technique that is being used now, and that is to really indoctrinate youth and young people, and to get youth advocates. So groups such as Planned Parenthood are not just targeting political figures now, or ministers of health, although that continues to be the case. But now a lot of the strategy is going towards creating leaders in this field. And so they're taking young men and women and they're training them to be youth advocates and to teach young people to go to high schools, to go to middle schools, elementary schools, to go to different areas. And so what they're doing is they're actually taking people that are young people, and they're not just doing it on a government level, they're trying to take the more social networking level and take the energy of young people to promote their values and their ideals, and although I don't like to use the word, but to push the agenda that is being said.
Mm-hmm. And what would you do to counteract that? Have you any thoughts in that regard?
I think there are multiple fronts that could be on this regard. One thing is that because this has almost been like a mammoth ideology that many people believe to be true, and it's promoted at all levels of government, including in the United States often, even though the Centers for Disease Control show different data, these organizations still do have a lot of power. So I would advocate awareness. I would really hope that especially parents, if they could become more aware of the actual risk that their child is taking. Many parents think that if they're helping protect their child if they give them shots of Gardasil or the birth control pill or condoms. But if they could actually be aware of the psychological side effects to early sexual debut, I would almost say premature sexual debut, if they could be aware of the real risk of STDs, and also I would say just the risk to the human person in the sense of their identity. So if parents could know, if more young people could know, so obviously getting the truth in college campuses, and there are a few organizations that go around to speak to young people, such as Generation Life, an organization I'm involved with in the Boston area called Pure in Heart also does so, to give a different message that is culturally relevant, scientifically accurate, and true to the whole human person.
I see. Well, we'll have to have them on sometime.
Yes.
Well, thank you so much for being on the show. And you mentioned that organization you volunteered for. What was that website again?
Yes, Family Watch International, and they have an excellent report on comprehensive sexual education, and it's called sexual health versus sexual rights. And they really outline how speaking about rights and not speaking about health and facts is very harmful to health.
I see. Well, thank you so much for being on the show
Thank
today.
you.
And thank you. We hope you learned a lot today. I know I did. And we hope that you find this show to be unique, informative, content-rich, truthful, and thought-provoking. Thanks for watching. I'm Brendan O'Connell, your friend for life.